There was a time in America when the holidays moved slowly, when winter arrived not with traffic jams and doorbuster ads, but with wood smoke curling into the sky and the sound of footsteps on snow-packed earth. Before flashing lights and crowded malls, the season felt softer. Families gathered not around television commercials or discount calendars, but around firelight, shared stories, and food that carried meaning far beyond taste. For Native American communities, the time we now call the holiday season held a different spirit. It was not built on buying, rushing, or beating crowds. It was built on gratitude, preparation, and the steady comfort of traditions passed down through generations. Each dish served in these early winter days had a purpose. Some honored the harvest, some offered strength for the cold ahead, others were shared simply because life was meant to be celebrated together, even when days were shorter and nights pressed long. There were meals cooked low and slow, with patience that modern life rarely makes room for. Corn pounded by hand, berries dried in late summer and saved for moments like this, venison smoked with care, wild rice gathered by canoe from lakes that mirrored the sky, foods that did not come from shelves or factories, but from land, community, and relationship. These dishes fed more than hunger. They carried memory. They told stories. They reminded families of who they were, where they came from, and what really mattered during the quiet start of winter. And while the world today may race toward sales and screens, those memories still sit deep in the soil of this continent. Waiting, breathing, holding a kind of warmth that money cannot touch. Many of these foods were pushed into silence. Some disappeared when land was taken, language suppressed, and tradition forced into hiding. Others faded because time changed faster than anyone expected. But the truth is simple. These meals are not really forgotten. They are sleeping. They remain in family memories, in tribal cookfires, in handwritten notes, in stories told quietly to children who still feel pride when they stir a pot that has simmered all afternoon. This journey is not about judgment or bitterness. It is about remembering. It is about giving voice to dishes that once mattered deeply and still deserve to be known. It is about honoring creativity, strength, and the gentle discipline of making something nourishing from what nature offered, not what advertising demanded. So today, we walk back into a season before the noise. We look at foods that warmed long winters and brought families together in the earliest holiday gatherings on this land. Not feasts of excess, but meals of gratitude and meaning. We explore traditions that carried hope, dignity, and connection through generations, and that continue to find their way back to tables once more. Because to understand these dishes is to understand a quieter America, a slower one that listened to the seasons, honored its ingredients, and believed that the best meals were not bought, but earned, shared, and remembered. Number 1. Three Sisters Harvest Stew. Long before crowded stores and flashing sales, there was a different kind of fall tradition in North America. Families gathered not around bargain counters, but around fire pits. Instead of rushing through aisles, they watched steam rise from clay pots, waiting for the first ladleful of a dish that symbolized survival, gratitude, and unity. The Three Sisters Harvest Stew. It started with 3 seeds planted side by side: corn, beans, and squash, each one depending on the other. Corn reaching toward the sun, beans wrapping the stalk like a promise, squash stretching across the ground, protecting the soil and holding moisture. Together, they weren't just crops. They were a living lesson passed down for thousands of years, a reminder that even in the harshest seasons, life finds ways to support life. When the harvest came, villages gathered. Children carried baskets. Elders stirred pots. Hunters returned with fresh meat or dried jerky to enrich the broth. Traders brought spices, seeds, stories. The stew simmered low and slow, layered with smoked vegetables, fire-roasted squash, and hand-pounded herbs. Often, bone broth or dried fish added depth. It wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. It was nourishment with meaning. This dish mattered because it gave more than warmth. It represented a bond with the land, a relationship built on respect, not extraction. Eating it was a way of saying thank you. Thank you to the harvest, to the soil, to each other. For many communities, these gatherings came right as colder winds began cut across fields and rivers. It was a moment to breathe before winter tightened its grip. Food was shared freely, not bought. Wealth wasn't measured by what you owned, but by how much you could give. And then the world changed. Trade routes shifted. Colonization disrupted planting traditions. Forced relocations severed families from their fields. Government rations replaced ancient agricultural knowledge with processed staples. The Three Sisters, once a lifeline, were pushed aside for canned flour, lard, and refined sugar. What was once a celebration of abundance became a memory whispered by elders who remembered the taste of earth, fire, and togetherness. Today, the stew returns in cultural centers, powwows, and revitalization programs. Not as a trendy heritage recipe, but as a way home, a way to reconnect with the soil and the people who tended it long before highways and malls. Imagine a table now, the day after Thanksgiving, maybe. Shopping bags in the corner, coupons crumpled, and in the center, a pot of Three Sisters stew, steam rising like history retold. The first spoonful reminding us that some traditions weren't meant to be replaced. They were meant to be remembered. Up next, we move deeper into these forgotten flavors, into a dish once sweetened by hand-foraged fruit and patience. A bread that carried the taste of fall forests and community fires. 2. Acorn bread with wild berry honey. Picture late autumn woods. Leaves drift in slow spirals. Crisp air carries the crackle of small fires and the soft rhythm of wooden pestles. There was no rush, no countdown clock screaming urgency. Just families gathering what nature offered, one acorn at a time. Acorns were once a cornerstone food across many native communities, especially in California, the Southwest, and the eastern woodlands. Not the bitter bite most people imagine today, but a carefully prepared, nourishing flower. Children collected them in woven baskets. Elders sorted them by hand. Then came the quiet art, shelling, grinding, leaching. Hours spent soaking the meal in cold, running water to remove tannins. Patience wasn't a burden, it was the recipe. The bread that came from that work was humble and thick with character, earthy, toasty, slightly sweet when roasted near the hearth. Sometimes it was shaped into small loaves, sometimes thin cakes cooked on hot stones. It was fuel for winter hunts, trade journeys, and long storytelling nights. And when berry season overlapped with the late harvest acorns, wild honey and crushed berries were drizzled on top. Sweetness earned through seasons, not bought from a shelf. Why did it matter? Because acorn bread was more than food. It was a seasonal ritual, a way to honor the forests that sustained life. A community rhythm built on memory and shared labor. It connected generations, children learning from grandparents, young gatherers proving their skill, elders passing down not just recipes, but identity. Then came the change. European wheat replaced acorns in forced diets. Government rations pushed bleached flour and sugar. Gathering sites were fenced, logged, or paved. By the early 1900s, many families kept only fragments of a tradition that once defined the rhythm of autumn. There is an emotional sting in that loss. Not just the disappearance of a dish, but the fading of a season's heartbeat. A food tied to gratitude and survival, replaced by packaged goods and commercial holidays. Today, when fall arrives, shoppers line up under fluorescent lights. They chase discounts, not harvest blessings. Meanwhile, the trees that fed whole communities for thousands of years drop acorns unseen, unnoticed. Yet the old ways are not gone. Tribal food revivalists are returning to the rivers and forests, teaching grinding techniques, restoring oak groves, and sharing acorn recipes in language classes, community centers, and family kitchens. Each loaf is a small rebellion against forgetting. Imagine a plate now. Warm acorn bread, rustic and fragrant, a smear of honey, dark with wild berries. Outside, autumn leaves drift the same way they always have. Inside, each bite reconnects you to a time when food wasn't rushed and gratitude was measured in patience, not price tags. 3. Bison fat fry bread before sugar and canned goods. Today, fry bread often shows up at powwows and festivals, warm and golden, dusted with sugar or topped with savory meat. But long before government rations forced flour and lard into native diets, there was another version, one richer, more sacred, born not from survival under hardship, but from abundance and ceremony. Picture open plains stretching under a wide sky, a time when buffalo herds moved like dark rivers across the grass, when every part of the animal served a purpose. Meat smoked for winter, bones turned to tools, hides into shelter and warmth. And from the rendered fat came something precious, tallow, smooth, clean, and deeply flavorful. It wasn't just cooking fat, it was nourishment and respect in edible form. Original fry bread wasn't puffed and greasy. It wasn't a quick fix meal. It was a celebratory food made with hand-milled grains, often corn or native seeds, mixed with water and a bit of salt when available. Rolled or pressed gently, cooked in bubbling bison fat over a fire. The result was hearty, crisp on the edges, dense and nutty in the center. A bread meant to feed hunters, families, and travelers gathering for seasonal trade and winter preparation. Why did it matter? Because that bread represented a relationship with the land and the buffalo that sustained so many nations. It carried the aroma of smoke and prairie grass. It tasted like community, hunting skill, resilience, and gratitude. It nourished not only bodies, but traditions, making it required time, knowledge, and intention. It wasn't convenience food, it was connection food. Then history intervened. The buffalo were slaughtered, not for sustenance, but strategy, to break communities, to force dependence. By the late 1800s, reservation rations replaced deep roots in land and diet. Flour, lard, and canned goods became staples where once there had been game, corn, and wild harvests. That shift wasn't an accident, it was policy. And from those rations came the fry bread most Americans know today. A symbol of survival, yes, but also a reminder of loss. There's a complicated emotion here. Pride in the creativity that kept families alive through forced scarcity. Pain in knowing a dish born under pressure replaced one born from abundance and tradition. For many Native families, fry bread is both comfort and history lesson. In recent years, chefs and cultural stewards have started reclaiming the older ways, rendering bison fat again, grinding heritage grains, bringing back the flavors that existed long before metal cans and paper sacks. Each loaf cooked over flame is an act of honoring what once was and could be again. Picture sitting beside that fire. The first sizzle as dough meets hot tallow, the smell rising into clean prairie air. No shopping bags, no rush, just bread made with patience, courage, and memory. Haber 4, cranberry and cedar wood smoked venison. Before screens blinked sales alerts and crowds lined up before dawn, people once woke to the crackle of fire and the scent of wood smoke curling into cold air. Across forested homelands, hunters returned with venison, and berries gathered at the season's end were saved for moments of meaning. Together, they became a dish that tasted like winter's first breath, cedar smoked venison glazed with tart cranberries. In many Northeastern and Great Lakes tribes, the arrival of late fall meant preparation. Snow was near. Rivers would soon freeze. Game became precious, and every cut mattered. Hunters carved meat with practiced strokes. Lean slices were hung above cedar or maple smoke, slow-dried or lightly roasted until tender. Cedar wasn't just fuel. It carried spirit and purpose. Its smoke honored the animal and scented the air with something clean and sacred. Cranberries, small and bright as drops of garnet, came next. Gathered from bogs and riverbanks, they were tart medicine and vibrant food. Mixed with a touch of honey or maple sap, they transformed into a glaze. Poured over smoked venison, the berries brought brightness to rich meat, a balance of sharp and earthy. Some versions included parched corn or rendered fat, forming early versions of pemmican. Others were reserved for feasts that marked the end of gathering season and the start of winter's watchfulness. This dish mattered because it fit the rhythm of the land. Slow smoking conserved meat. Cranberries preserved themselves. Nothing wasted. Nothing taken lightly. It wasn't a meal built from convenience, but from deep respect for animal and earth. Families shared it after hunts, during trade meetings, and in quiet winter circles. Eating it was both nourishment and gratitude for the deer, the season, the safety of community. Then came the shift. Forced removals broke hunting routes. Logging cleared cedar stands. Cranberry marshes turned into farmland and towns. Government rations introduced salt pork, canned beef, and processed sugar. Venison became scarce not by nature but by design. What once hung above smoke now sat behind store glass. There is a quiet sorrow here. A tradition shaped by land and spirit, pushed aside by policy and profit. Cranberries lost their original role as sacred winter fruit and became a sweet sauce on corporate holiday tables. Venison, once central to survival, turned into a specialty item instead of a way of life. Yet, as with so many native foods, this dish is returning. Hunters teach butchering in community centers. Foragers gather wild berries where they still grow. Young cooks smoke meat again over cedar, reclaiming flavors that lived in the memories of grandparents. Each plate is a reminder that history breathes. It waits for us to listen. Imagine that meal now. Thin slices of smoky venison, cranberry glaze gleaming like winter fire, a bite that wakes the senses. No rush, no noise. Just food that carries a story older than any sale or season. 5. Maple roasted squash boats. Before stamping feet in cold morning lines and racing carts down fluorescent aisles, families gathered around earth pit ovens and glowing coals. The air crackled with frost and faint wood smoke, and on those early winter evenings, one dish carried warmth like a memory passed hand to hand: squash boats roasted with maple, nuts, and seeds. In native communities throughout the Northeast and Great Lakes, winter squash wasn't just food. It was companionship for the cold months. Harvested carefully, stored in bark or reed baskets, and checked like precious treasure, each squash represented safety against a long winter. The land offered its sweetness slowly, and people responded with patience. Preparing this dish began hours before mealtime. Squash was split carefully, seeds scooped and saved for roasting or planting. The hollows were filled with crushed walnuts, seeds, sometimes wild rice or dried berries. Maple sap or syrup was drizzled inside, seeping into the soft golden flesh. Some cooks rubbed the edges with animal fat for richness. Others dusted the top with dried herbs gathered in late summer. Then the magic step, the earth oven. Heated stones, layered leaves, and covered pits turned the ground itself into a slow-cooking hearth. The squash would roast gently, steam swirling beneath the soil until its skin blistered and its flesh caramelized. When uncovered, the aroma floated like a quiet celebration. Sweet, smoky, honest. Why did it matter? Because this dish wasn't rushed. It wasn't eaten to fill time, but to mark it. It sat at the center of winter feasts, shared by families who measured wealth in warmth, laughter, and presence. Children scraped the soft insides like treasure from a shell. Elders blessed the meal. Everyone knew the hands that grew it, harvested it, prepared it. Then came the turn in history. Removal from homelands meant leaving behind fertile river valleys and maple groves. Cattle and sugar mills replaced wild orchards. Government ration systems favored flour, salt pork, and canned goods over seeds and squash. Slow cooking gave way to survival cooking. Maple syrup became rare luxury instead of seasonal right. A dish rooted in land and patience faded under pressure and policy. There's beauty and ache in this memory, a sweetness that once signaled home, warmth, and the patience of community, traded for quick calories in tin cans. The earth oven, once central to winter meals, covered over by time and asphalt. But revival is happening. Tribal farmers cultivate heirloom squash again. Sugar makers tap trees by hand, renewing a spring ritual. Young cooks roast squash in fire pits and home ovens, reclaiming ancestral flavors in small kitchens and community gatherings. A new generation is learning to slow down, to cook by Earth's rhythm, not retail calendars. Imagine sitting around that fire tonight, the squash split open, steam curling into cold air, seeds glistening, maple pooling in the hollow, a spoon scraping tender flesh, and in that simple bite, a reminder that some traditions don't disappear. They wait for us to return. Next, we move north to the waterways where canoes glided through reeds and a grain more precious than gold was gathered by hand. Our 6, wild rice with hazelnut and mushroom. Picture a lake at dawn. Mist drifts low across the surface. Canoes glide silently through tall reeds. Paddles move not in haste, but with care, following rhythms older than memory. In the bow, someone leans forward with a pair of cedar knock sticks, tapping the wild rice gently, coaxing grains into the canoe. This wasn't farming in rows and fields. This was a dance with water and wind. A harvest done softly so the plant would seed again and again. Across the Great Lakes region, wild rice, manumin, was more than a food. It was a promise, prophecy even. Some nations followed visions that led them to the place where food grows on water, and they found it here. Floating meadows of long, slender grains, nutrition rich enough to sustain whole communities through winter. After the rice dried and roasted over an open fire, it was winnowed by hand. Feet in moccasins gently stepped inside a bark-lined bag to loosen chaff. Breezes or baskets tossed the kernels until only pure rice remained. Each step was slow and sacred. Harvest wasn't extraction, it was stewardship. The dish that followed was simple, and that simplicity made it powerful. Wild rice simmered slowly until tender and fragrant. Hazelnuts cracked and roasted. Forest mushrooms foraged from mossy logs, sautéed in fat or broth. Everything earthy, warm and deeply grounding. A bowl that tasted like autumn woods, lake air, and patience. Why did it matter? Because food isn't just flavor, it is identity, landscape, prayer. Sharing this dish meant more than eating. It meant honoring water, trees, animals, and people. It filled bellies, yes, but it also reinforced belonging. A young person learning to paddle, to tap the rice gently, to roast it without burning. They weren't just learning a recipe, they were learning who they were. Then history shifted. Dams altered lake levels, logging muddied the water, mining runoff poisoned wetlands, railroads and farms carved up access to ancestral harvest sites. Later, commercial operations tried to manufacture wild rice in paddies, stripping it of spirit and ecology for convenience and profit. And yet the real manumin, the one that sways in wild lakes and listens to canoes, survived, held by elders, protected by treaty fights. Tended by families who returned every fall, whether history welcomed them or not. Today, revival is not just nostalgic, it's active. Tribal nations restore wetlands, youth programs teach paddling and parching. Chefs serve manumin in ways both old and new. Each bowl reminds us that some foods don't just nourish bodies, they repair memory. Imagine holding that warm bowl on a cold morning, steam rising, nuts crackling, mushrooms soft and earthy. The first spoonful grounding you in something deeper than flavor, in the truth that food tied to place can never truly disappear so long as someone remembers how to return. Nausea 7. Corn pashofa with smoked turkey. Before leftovers filled plastic tubs and shopping trips kicked off the season, people once gathered around clay pots and slow fires. There were no frantic deals to chase. Instead, there was time. Time to stir, to share, to sit together. And in Choctaw communities, that time often tasted like pashofa, a slow-cooked corn dish that fed crowds, healed spirits, and marked moments that mattered. Pashofa began with corn, not the sweet yellow kernels most people picture today, but hominy-style white corn dried under sun and sky. Each kernel hand-washed, pounded, and softened. Preparing it took patience, soaking, stirring, removing hulls by hand, every step intentional. This was food shaped by effort, not hurry. Into large pots went the corn, simmered gently with water until it opened and softened. Meat followed. often smoked turkey, long before store-bought birds and freezers existed. Turkeys were hunted in forests, smoked over hickory or oak, and shredded into tender pieces that blended with the slowly swelling corn. The flavor was deep and clean: smoke, earth, time. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Pashofa wasn't just a meal, it was a social anchor. Families prepared massive pots for communal gatherings that could last all day. People arrived bringing dishes, stories, and laughter. Children ran between fires. Elders sat nearby, watching, remembering. It served at weddings, at harvest feasts, at ceremonies that required strength and unity. The pot stayed on the fire long after everyone had eaten because community didn't run on a schedule. Why did it matter? Because Pashofa was nourishment with purpose. It strengthened bodies after long hunts and during cold months. It brought people together not around competition but around gratitude. It represented generosity, that the measure of abundance was how much you could share, not how much you could store. Then everything shifted. Forced removal uprooted families from their Mississippi homelands. The Trail of Tears carried not only people, but traditions across hundreds of miles. Access to game changed. Corn varieties changed. Trade networks broke. Yet even in the hardest seasons, Pashofa remained, a thread of identity that refused to break. A dish that said, "We are still here." In time, modern life crept in. Canned broths, instant foods, microwaves, and holiday rushes replaced the slow rhythm of boiling corn by fire. But in Choctaw homes and communities, Pashofa still simmers, sometimes over gas stoves instead of earth pits, sometimes with stainless steel ladles instead of carved wooden spoons. But the heartbeat remains the same. Picture this moment: a big pot steaming in the cool air, corn gently rolling in broth, smoke-flavored turkey softening as it falls apart. People gathered not because they must, but because they choose to. A spoonful warm in your hands, carrying stories of endurance and belonging. In a world that now moves too fast, Pashofa asks us to slow down, to stir with intention, to show up for one another. Section 8, expanded in full in the same tone as the others. Section 8, Venison and Wild Rice Early Winter Bake. Before brightly lit malls and frantic checkout lines, the start of winter meant something quieter. It meant gathering the last gifts of fall, storing strength for the cold ahead, and sharing meals that felt like ceremony more than supper. One of those meals was venison baked gently with wild rice, dried berries, and herbs. Simple, earned, sacred. Across the upper Midwest and Great Lakes, native families harvested manoomin, wild rice gathered by canoe, kissed by lake winds, and parched over an open fire. It wasn't farmed. It wasn't processed. It was a living gift from water and sky. Paired with venison hunted responsibly and dried berries brought out from storage, this dish was a reminder that preparation meant survival. Nothing rushed, nothing wasted. Imagine meat seared just enough to scent the air, then laid into clay or cast iron. Wild rice rinsed and added in, swelling slowly as it cooked. Hand-picked cranberries or chokecherries lending a hint of tart sweetness. Juniper or sage giving quiet depth. Hours later, the lid lifted and steam rising like breath on a cold morning. A meal humble in ingredients, rich in meaning. This wasn't only fuel, it was a gathering point. Elders tasted to see if seasoning was right. Hunters shared stories. Children learned patience by waiting. When that first spoonful finally came, it warmed more than the stomach. It calmed the spirit. It told everyone at the table, winter is coming, but we are ready. We prepared together. We will endure together. Then came disruption. Treaty promises broken, rice beds damaged by logging, mining, and dams, hunting restricted, traditional gathering outlawed in some places. Slowly, this dish faded from everyday life. What had nourished hearts and bodies for centuries became something whispered about, remembered by a few, and nearly lost to time. And yet, the feeling remains, the pride in earning your meal, the comfort of knowing nature still provides when cared for. The quiet satisfaction of a pot lifted from fire after hours of patience. Today, tribes are restoring rice beds, teaching harvest by canoe again, and bringing venison stews back to community tables. Every spoonful is a revival, every bite a memory reclaimed. That's the truth hidden beneath its simplicity. This dish wasn't forgotten because it wasn't good. It was forgotten because the world tried to take it away. But traditions rooted in land and dignity don't die easily. They wait, they return, they feed again. Next, we move to a celebration food that once filled homes with sweetness right before winter tightened its grip. A dish that blended corn, berries, and honey into a treat children loved and elders guarded like gold. 9. Acorn bread and honey ash spread. Sometimes the most humble ingredients carry the deepest memory. Acorn bread was never a grand feast item. It didn't arrive on silver trays or sit at the center of a royal table. It was a quiet staple, a dependable hearth food, the kind of thing that warmed the hands before it filled the stomach. Across many native cultures, especially among tribes in the eastern woodlands and California regions, acorn flour was as common as wheat or corn would later become. Gathering acorns wasn't just practical. It was seasonal rhythm, tradition, and knowledge passed down hand to hand. Families collected, shelled, pounded, and rinsed the bitter tannins from the nuts before turning the flour into a hearty bread that tasted nutty and earthy, the kind of flavor that stays with you even if years pass before you taste it again. To go with it, many families made a sweet ash spread. It sounds unusual today, but ash wasn't just waste from the fire. It was food and mineral. When mixed with honey or berry syrup, it became a creamy, smoky sweet topping. Imagine a rustic spread, glossy and warm, melting into soft bread just pulled from the coals. This dish mattered because it was tied to patience and skill. You didn't make acorn bread quickly. You earned it. There was community in the gathering, pride in knowing which trees offered the best nuts, and wisdom in transforming something most settlers ignored into something beautiful and nourishing. For generations, it was a symbol of resilience and respect for the land. Then it faded. Industrial flour arrived, supermarkets replaced seasonal storage, sweet ash spreads sounded old-fashioned next to factory sugar. Even in communities where the recipe survived, it slowly moved from dinner table to memory. Some children raised in the mid-20th century remember their grandparents talking about acorns the way others talk about hand-churned butter. Warm stories, but not recipes anyone expected to see again. There's a quiet sadness in that. Not because everyone needs to cook acorns to feel connected, but because every time a food tradition slips away, a life rhythm goes with it. A way of noticing seasons, a way of working together, a way of tasting the landscape itself. And yet there's a hopeful twist. A handful of tribal food revivalists are bringing acorn dishes back, teaching the slow steps with pride, not for novelty, but for memory, for identity, for the simple truth that some things don't disappear, they wait. As we move forward, another dish waits in that same space between memory and revival. A food once shared during winter markets and trade gatherings, now nearly forgotten. A stew that warmed hunters, travelers, and elders alike. Section 10. Buffalo bone marrow and wild herb stew. Some meals weren't about luxury, they were about honoring every part of life that nature gave. Buffalo marrow stew wasn't simply cooked, it was respected. A dish that reminded everyone at the fire that waste was not a way of living, and gratitude was not just a word but a practice. Among Plains tribes, the buffalo was everything. Food, clothing, shelter, tools, even warmth on winter nights. Every bone carried value, and the marrow inside the biggest leg bones was treasured. It was rich, silky, and full of strength. Mixed with wild herbs like prairie sage, yarrow, wild onions, and seasonal greens, marrow created a broth that nourished the body and lifted the spirit. Picture a pot simmering low over an open fire, the scent of herbs rising into cold night air, slow-cooked marrow melting into the broth, turning water into something powerful. Each spoonful warm enough to keep fingers from stiffening and hearts from sinking during long winters. This wasn't comfort food in the modern sense, it was survival wrapped in warmth, memory, and respect, and it mattered deeply. Families didn't gather around this stew just to eat. They gathered to talk, to teach children how to use a bone tool or braid sinew, to listen to elders tell the stories that shaped them. Marrow stew wasn't just food, it was time. It was attention. It was community built one shared bowl at a time. Then things changed. Buffalo herds that once thundered across the plains were driven to near extinction, millions reduced to almost none. Settlers saw land as property lines, not sacred ground. Soldiers saw buffalo as a way to break nations from within. When the herds died, the stew died with them. Not just a recipe lost, but an entire set of relationships to land, to animal, to each other. The painful truth is that many Native families remember bones but not broth. They remember stories of the hunts, but no pot bubbling by the fire. The taste disappeared, and so did a quiet kind of power, the dignity of using every gift and the pride of turning scarcity into warmth. Still, there is strength in what remains. Today, small herds are returning, and tribal food programs are teaching marrow preparation again. Young people are learning what once came naturally to their ancestors. For some, that first taste brings tears, not because it's fancy or rich, but because it feels like home they never got to meet. And as we step into the next dish, we move from deep winter comfort to a celebration food, one passed around at gatherings where laughter mixed with dawn smoke. We often think progress means moving forward without looking back. But food has a way of dishes we visited were not lavish. They were not decorated with icing, wrapped in shiny paper, or sold with catchy slogans. They came from rivers, forests, and fields. They came from patience, gratitude, and skill shaped by generations who worked with nature instead of rushing past it. Every bowl of wild rice, every piece of venison, every berry dried in summer and saved for winter. Each carried a story. They carried warmth in the cold and comfort in times when survival and celebration lived side by side. These meals fed communities that understood winter not as something to escape, but as a season to prepare for, respect, and honor. It is easy today to forget the meaning of gathering. We rush, we scroll, we reduce the holiday season to a race against time and money. Yet as we look back at these forgotten native dishes, a gentle clarity returns. Celebration once meant sharing what you had, not showing what you could buy. It meant sitting long enough for stories to stretch across generations. It meant remembering that food is not only fuel, but a thread between past and present. We do not bring these dishes forward to be museum pieces. We bring them forward because some flavors are tied to identity, dignity, and belonging. Many recipes disappeared not because they lacked beauty or taste, but because history interrupted them. Yet traditions built on gratitude do not vanish easily. They wait patiently until someone asks where they came from. And today, more people are asking. Tribes are restoring wild rice beds. Young cooks are learning to dry corn again. Elders are sharing recipes once whispered only in family kitchens. Hunters are honoring the animal with respect, not sport. Slowly, quietly, these foods are returning, not as trends, but as truths. Remembering them does not mean rejecting the modern world. It simply means giving space to the parts of life that deserve more care than speed. It means recognizing that the deepest kind of abundance is not found in shopping bags, but in time shared, traditions honored, and meals made with intention. So as you finish this journey, take a breath. Think of a pot simmering over a fire. Think of a cold night softened by laughter and warm bowls passed hand to hand. Think of a world where food was not fast or disposable, but sacred, steady, and full of memory. Because these dishes do not just belong to history. They belong to anyone who believes meals should bring us closer to who we are and where we come from. They remind us that holiday seasons can be quiet, meaningful, and rooted in gratitude again. Maybe somewhere along the way we lost that rhythm. Now we have the chance to remember it. and that is worth more than any sale, gift, or countdown clock.